I was 70 years old when a stranger looked me in the eyes and told me to run from my own home. The plumber had gone down into the crawl space beneath my kitchen that morning, whistling and calm, with his toolbox and his flashlight. He came back up 20 minutes later with a face drained of all color, hands trembling like he'd seen death itself, and whispered words that would shatter every memory I'd built over 46 years of marriage. Pack your things and leave. Don't tell your children. I know what's buried down there. What he found beneath the floorboards of the kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals, where my children took their first steps, where I'd lived my entire adult life, wasn't a gas leak. It was a secret so dark, so unthinkable, that it would force me to question every moment of love I thought I'd known. My husband had been dead for 5 years, buried with honors, mourned by everyone who knew him. But the truth he'd sealed under our floor was still alive, still breathing, still waiting to be discovered. And when I finally had the courage to dig, what I unearthed wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was the destruction of everything I believed about the man I'd slept beside for 45 years. This is the story of how I discovered that the foundation of my entire life was built on top of a grave, and how sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves. If you want to know what happens when the truth finally breaks through after decades of silence, stay with me until the end. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below where you're watching from. This is a story you won't forget. I was 70 years old when the floor of my kitchen started telling truths I never wanted to hear. That morning began like any other Tuesday in late September. The kind of day where the sunlight comes through the lace curtains at just the right angle, making everything look softer than it really is. I remember standing at the stove, stirring my coffee with that old silver spoon my grandmother brought over from Ireland, watching the steam rise and thinking about absolutely nothing important. The radio was playing Johnny Cash, Ring of Fire, and I hummed along without really knowing I was doing it. Outside, the construction crew was already laughing and hammering, tearing apart my old kitchen like it was nothing more than kindling. The renovation had been Michael's idea. My son, always practical, always worried about property values and resale potential, even though I told him 100 times I wasn't planning on going anywhere. "Mom, the pipes are from 1952, he'd said, using that tone he reserves for when he thinks I'm being stubborn. You could have a flood, or worse. Ruth had agreed, of course. My daughter never disagreed with her brother when it came to matters of the house that had belonged to their father, the man we'd buried 5 years ago under the oak tree at St. Catherine's Cemetery. The house smelled like sawdust and memories that day. Every nail they pulled loose seemed to release another ghost. The time Arthur burned the Thanksgiving turkey in '73. The afternoon Ruth took her first steps right there by the refrigerator. The countless Sunday dinners with the whole family crammed around that old Formica table. I'd embroidered those lace curtains the year Arthur died, sitting in his armchair because I couldn't bear to put his things away yet, my fingers working the needle while my mind went numb with grief. Everything seemed normal, perfectly, beautifully normal, until the plumber went down into the crawl space beneath the kitchen floor. His name was Carl. I'd never met him before that day. The contractor had hired him, said he was good with old houses, knew how to work with pipes that hadn't been touched in decades. He was younger than my own children, maybe 35, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much too soon. The kind of eyes that made you want to offer him coffee and ask if everything was all right at home. When he first arrived, he'd been perfectly pleasant, shook my hand with those rough, calloused palms, called me ma'am the way young men from good families do. He'd gone down into that crawl space around 10 in the morning, carrying his toolbox and a flashlight, whistling something I couldn't quite make out. He came back up 20 minutes later, looking like he'd seen the devil himself. I was at the kitchen sink, rinsing out my coffee cup and watching a cardinal hop along the fence outside, when I heard his boots on the stairs. Heavy, uneven steps, the kind of footsteps that told you something had gone very, very wrong. When I turned around, Carl was standing in the doorway of my kitchen, and his face was the color of old newspaper. Not just pale, drained, like someone had opened a valve and let all the blood run out of him. His hands were shaking, actually trembling the way my mother's hands used to shake when she had one of her spells. The toolbox clattered when he set it down, the sound too loud in the sudden silence. Outside, the other workers had stopped hammering. Even the radio seemed to have gone quiet, though I know that's impossible. "Mrs. Turner," he said, and his voice cracked like a teenage boy's. "Helen, ma'am." I smiled, trying to ease whatever had frightened him. "What is it, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." But he didn't smile back. He took 2 steps toward me, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool autumn air coming through the open window. His eyes were wet, brimming with something that looked like terror and pity mixed together in equal measure. "You need to pack a bag," he whispered. "Right now. Pack your things and get out of this house." I laughed. It was such an absurd thing to say that I actually laughed, a nervous little sound that came out higher than I intended. "What on earth are you talking about?" "There's gas," he said, but his eyes darted away from mine when he said it, like he was lying. "A leak. A bad one. This whole place." He gestured around the kitchen, the gesture wild and uncontrolled. "It could go up any second. You need to leave. Now." That's when I smelled it. Not strongly, not the overwhelming stench you'd expect from a deadly gas leak. Just a whisper of something sweet and heavy in the air, something that hadn't been there before, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up like they do before a thunderstorm. And underneath that smell, there was something else, something organic and wrong that I couldn't quite place. The house felt different suddenly, like it was holding its breath, like the walls were listening. "I'll call the gas company," I said, moving toward the phone, but Carl grabbed my arm. His grip was too tight, desperate, his fingers digging into my cardigan. "No." His voice broke completely. "No police, no fire department, no gas company. Just go. Get in your car and drive away and don't come back until—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Just don't come back." "Young man, you're scaring me." But I was more than scared. Something in his eyes was making my chest tight, making it hard to breathe. "If there's really a gas leak, don't tell your children," he said suddenly, urgently, leaning in close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath and see the tiny scar above his left eyebrow. "Don't call them. Don't tell them where you're going. Do you understand me? Don't tell Michael or Ruth anything." The way he said their names, my children's names, like he knew them, like he'd been planning this. A cold shock ran through me. "How do you know?" "Please." And now there were actual tears running down his face, cutting tracks through the dust on his cheeks. "Please, Mrs. Turner, I'm begging you. Just trust me and go." My hands were shaking now too. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to break free. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was terribly, impossibly wrong. But it wasn't the gas leak making me afraid. It was the look in this young man's eyes. It was the way he kept glancing down at the floor, at that specific spot beneath the old farmhouse sink, where Arthur had always told me never to touch, never to renovate, never to let anyone dig. "What did you find down there?" I whispered. Carl's face crumpled. For a moment I thought he might collapse right there on my kitchen floor. He looked down at that spot, the worn linoleum, the slight depression in the wood beneath it, and when he looked back up at me, his voice was barely audible. "I know what's buried there, Mrs. Turner." A sob caught in his throat. "God help me. I know what your husband did." The world tilted. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my marriage, about the man who'd shared my bed for 45 years, it all started to crack like ice breaking on a frozen pond. I heard a sound come out of my own mouth, something between a gasp and a moan, and suddenly I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at this stranger who was destroying my entire existence with 7 simple words. "I know what your husband did. Get out," I heard myself say, but my voice sounded far away. "Get out of my house." I can't leave you here." Carl was backing toward the door, grabbing his jacket. "If you won't go, I have to call—" "You won't call anyone," I said, and something hard and cold had settled in my chest. "You'll leave. and you'll never come back, and we'll forget this conversation ever happened." But even as I said it, I was reaching for my purse. My fingers found the leather strap automatically, the way they'd done 10,000 times before. And then they found my keys. And then, without deciding to do it, without choosing it, I was grabbing my coat from the hook by the door. The crucifix that had hung on the kitchen wall since 1968, the one Arthur had brought back from his trip to Mexico City, I took that too, clutching it in my fist until the metal cut into my palm. Carl was already at the door, looking back at me with those haunted eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so goddamn sorry." I pushed past him, out into the cool September air that suddenly felt too thin, too bright. Behind me, my house, the house where I'd raised my children, where I'd buried my dreams and built my life, stood quiet and still under the morning sun. The workers had scattered, confused by the commotion. The radio was still playing somewhere, a distant sound that didn't make sense anymore. The house looked the same as it always had, the same white siding, the same blue shutters, the same rose bushes Arthur had planted along the foundation. But now, standing in the driveway with my purse and my coat and that cold metal crucifix cutting into my hand, it looked different. It looked like a tomb, like something that had been holding its breath for 30 years, waiting for someone to finally dig deep enough to find what was hidden underneath. And as I stumbled toward my car, my legs barely holding me up, I could feel it, a pulse, a presence, something alive and terrible beneath those old wooden floorboards. The house wasn't about to explode, but my life was. And somewhere in the back of my mind, behind the shock and the fear and the terrible, terrible suspicion that was starting to take root, I heard Arthur's voice. Not a memory, something sharper than that, more real. His voice from all those years ago, stern and final. "Don't touch the floor in the kitchen, Helen. Promise me. That's old work, old pipes. You leave it alone." I'd promised. God help me, I'd promised. And now I was driving away from everything I'd ever known, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, tears streaming down my face that I didn't remember starting to cry. And the only thing I could think was, what did you do, Arthur? What did you bury under our kitchen floor? What have I been living on top of all these years? The crucifix was still in my hand, warm now from my grip, and I realized I was praying. Words I'd said 1,000,000 times before, but now they felt different, desperate, bargaining. Please let him be wrong. Please let this be a mistake. Please let my husband have been the man I thought he was. But deep down, in that place where we keep the truths we're too afraid to speak out loud, I already knew. I drove for 2 hours before I realized I had nowhere to go. The highway stretched out in front of me like a gray ribbon, endless and meaningless, and I kept the gas pedal pressed down without thinking, without planning, just driving because stopping meant having to face what Carl had said, what he'd implied, what he'd seen down there in the darkness beneath my kitchen floor. My hands ached from gripping the steering wheel. The crucifix had left a deep red mark across my palm, almost like a brand, and I kept looking at it at red lights, tracing the shape with my thumb, wondering if this was some kind of punishment, some kind of sign. Eventually, I ended up at a rest stop somewhere outside of Lancaster, one of those horrible concrete places with fluorescent lights and vending machines that hum too loud and families arguing over who gets the last pack of chips. I sat in my car in the parking lot for what must have been an hour, maybe more, watching people come and go, watching them live their normal lives while mine fell apart in slow motion. That's when my phone started ringing. Michael's name lit up the screen, and my first instinct was to answer, to hear my son's voice and let him tell me everything was fine, that Carl was crazy, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. But then I remembered what Carl had said. Don't tell your children. Don't call them. I let it ring. Once, twice, 7 times. Then it stopped. Then it started again. I turned the phone off. The silence in the car was suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven, and the tick of the engine cooling down, and somewhere far away, a truck's air brakes hissing like a snake. I closed my eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. They stuck in my throat like broken glass. By the time I drove back home, because where else could I go? Where else was there? It was almost evening. The sun was setting in that particular way it does in autumn, painting everything orange and gold, making the world look beautiful even when it's dying. The construction trucks were gone from my driveway. The house stood quiet and dark against the sky, and for a moment, just a moment, it looked like it always had, like home. But I couldn't make myself go inside. I sat in my car until the street lights came on, until Mrs. Patterson next door turned on her porch light and peered out her window at me, probably wondering if I'd finally lost my mind. Maybe I had. Maybe that would be easier than this, than knowing something terrible and not knowing what it was, than feeling the ground shift beneath your feet, but not being able to see the hole opening up. When I finally walked through the front door, the house felt different. The air was heavier somehow, pressing down on my shoulders, making it hard to move through the rooms. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a voice, like the house was trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. The police had been there. Carl must have called them after all, despite what he'd said. There was a business card stuck in the doorframe. Officer Raymond Chen with a handwritten note. No gas leak detected. House is safe. Please call if you have concerns. Safe. I laughed. A broken sound that echoed too loud in the empty hallway. Safe. If they only knew. If anyone knew. I walked through every room, turning on every light. Like brightness could chase away whatever darkness Carl had uncovered. In the kitchen, the renovation was half finished. Cabinets torn away from the walls. The old linoleum pulled up in strips, exposing the subflooring beneath. And there, right there beneath where the sink had been, I could see the scratches in the wood. Fresh scratches like someone had been digging, searching, like Carl had been looking for something and found it. My legs gave out, and I sank down onto the floor. Right there in the middle of the destruction, surrounded by the broken pieces of my kitchen, of my life. The wood was cold beneath me, and I pressed my palms flat against it, feeling every groove, every nail head, every imperfection. Somewhere beneath this floor, beneath my hands, there was something. Some secret Arthur had kept from me for all those years we'd lived together, slept together, built a life together. That night I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Arthur's face. Not the way he looked when he died, gray and small in that hospital bed, but the way he looked when we first bought this house. Young and strong and full of plans. He'd carried me over the threshold, laughing, my white dress catching on the doorframe. "This is it, Helen," he'd said, spinning me around in the empty living room. "This is where we'll grow old together." We had grown old together. But what else had we done? What else had happened in this house that I'd been too blind, too trusting, too much in love to see? Around 3 a.m, I heard it for the first time. A sound from beneath the floor. Not loud, barely audible really. A settling sound, I told myself. Old houses make noise. The wood expands and contracts. Pipes shift. It was nothing, but it sounded like breathing. Slow, labored breathing, like someone or something was trapped down there, waiting. I got up and walked to the kitchen, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. The moon was coming through the window, casting long shadows across the torn-up room, and I stood there in my nightgown like a ghost in my own house, listening. There it was again, a creak, a groan, a sound like weight shifting against wood. And then, so faint I almost missed it, a whisper of air moving through a crack in the floorboards. The house was breathing. I dropped to my knees and pressed my ear against the floor, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Nothing, just silence now, but I could feel it, a presence, a wrongness, something that didn't belong. When I lifted my head, I saw it, a small piece of metal, barely visible in the moonlight, sticking up between 2 boards. It was right there, right where the old sink used to be, exactly where Arthur had told me never to touch. I reached for it with trembling fingers, and when I pulled, the board lifted slightly, revealing a gap beneath. The smell that came up was old and damp. like earth that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. And there was something else, something metallic and cold. I should have called someone, the police, Michael, anyone. But Carl's words kept echoing in my head. Don't tell them. Don't tell anyone. So I didn't. I just sat there on the floor of my ruined kitchen, holding that piece of metal in my hand. It was a corner of something, a hinge maybe, attached to something larger underneath, and I let myself cry. Not the pretty crying you see in movies, but the ugly kind, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and broken inside you. I cried for the girl I'd been when I married Arthur. I cried for the life I thought I'd had. I cried for whatever truth was buried beneath my feet. And somewhere in the distance, I heard Arthur's voice again, as clear as if he were standing right behind me. Don't touch the floor, Helen. Promise me you'll never touch the floor. But I had touched it now. I had pulled back the veil, and there was no going back. When the sun finally rose, painting my kitchen in shades of pink and gold, I was still sitting there, staring at that gap in the floor, at the darkness underneath, and I made a decision. I would dig. Whatever Carl had found, whatever Arthur had hidden, whatever terrible truth was buried beneath this house, I would find it myself, even if it destroyed me. I waited until Thursday morning to begin digging, 3 days after Carl had run from my house, with terror in his eyes. 3 days of barely eating, barely sleeping, barely existing in the hollow shell of the life I used to know. Michael called 17 times. Ruth called 11. I let every single call go to voicemail, listening to their voices grow more frantic, more angry, more worried. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" Michael demanded in the last message. "The contractor says you threw everyone out. He says you're acting crazy. Call me back or I'm coming over there." But I couldn't let them come. Not yet. Not until I knew. I told myself I was waiting for them to be busy. Michael had that conference in Philadelphia. Ruth had her yoga retreat in the Poconos. I told myself I was being smart, strategic, but the truth was simpler and more terrible. I was afraid of what they'd see in my eyes if they looked at me. Afraid they'd know I was about to desecrate their father's memory, about to dig up the foundation of everything we'd built as a family. That Thursday morning was cold. October had arrived with frost on the windows and a wind that rattled the shutters like skeleton fingers. I made coffee, but couldn't drink it. Made toast, but couldn't swallow. My hands shook as I gathered my tools. A bread knife from the drawer, the claw hammer from Arthur's old toolbox in the garage, a flashlight, and a pair of gardening gloves that still smelled like the tomatoes I'd planted last spring, back when the world made sense. The kitchen looked like a war zone. Torn linoleum, exposed subflooring, dust covering every surface. The workers had been neat, professional, careful, but I was about to undo all of that. I was about to make a mess that couldn't be cleaned up. I pushed the kitchen table aside, that old oak table where we'd eaten thousands of meals, where I taught my children to read, where Arthur used to do the crossword every Sunday morning with reading glasses perched on his nose. It scraped across the floor with a sound like screaming, and I had to stop, press my hand to my chest, force myself to breathe. "You don't have to do this," a voice in my head whispered. "You could call someone. You could stop." But I couldn't stop. Not anymore. The not knowing was worse than any truth could be. I knelt down on the exposed subflooring, right at the spot where the old sink had been, the spot Carl had stared at with those haunted eyes, the spot where I'd found that piece of metal. In the morning light, I could see it clearly now, a corner of something metallic, painted over but still visible if you knew to look. Rust had eaten away at the edges, making it look like an old wound. I started with the bread knife, working it between the floorboards, prying gently at first, then harder when the wood wouldn't give. The sound was horrible, a splintering, tearing sound that seemed too loud in the empty house. Each crack of the wood felt like I was breaking bones, like the house itself was screaming at me to stop. Sweat dripped down my back despite the cold. My hands ached. The gloves made everything clumsy, but I couldn't take them off. Couldn't bear the thought of touching whatever was down there with my bare skin. After 20 minutes of work, I'd pulled up 3 boards, revealing a dark space beneath. The smell that rose up made me gag. Damp earth, old metal, and something else. Something organic and wrong that I couldn't identify. It was the smell of things that should stay buried, of secrets that have rotted in the dark for too long. I picked up the flashlight with shaking hands and shined it into the hole. At first I couldn't understand what I was seeing. There was dirt, yes, and old pipes and cobwebs thick as curtains. But there was something else too, something that didn't belong. A metal box, maybe 2 feet square, set into the earth like a coffin. It had a lid, sealed with what looked like tar or pitch, and on top of that lid, scratched into the metal with something sharp, were letters. I leaned closer, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, and read the inscription, 1979, A.H., the year 1979. Arthur's initials, the year Lila Dawson disappeared. The memory hit me like a physical blow. I was back in our old apartment, the one we'd lived in before we bought this house, listening to Arthur talk about his secretary. She quit, he'd said, not meeting my eyes across the dinner table. Just didn't show up one day, left all her things at the office. Police think she might have run off with some guy. Lila Dawson, 23 years old, red hair, freckles across her nose, a laugh that Arthur had mentioned too many times, in too much detail. I'd been jealous then, ashamed of myself for it, but jealous nonetheless. And then she'd vanished, and Arthur had seemed relieved. I'd noticed it at the time, but pushed it away, told myself I was being paranoid, being a suspicious wife when I should have been trusting. But wives know things. We know things we pretend not to know. We see things we train ourselves not to see. My vision blurred with tears. I wiped them away angrily with the back of my glove, leaving streaks of dirt across my face. I had to keep going, had to know for sure. I set down the flashlight and reached into the hole, my fingers finding the edge of the metal box. It was cold, so cold it burned through the gloves. I pulled, but it wouldn't budge. It was set deep into the earth, maybe even bolted to something beneath. That's when I heard the knock at the back door. I froze, my hand still in the hole, my heart stopping completely. For a wild second I thought it might be the police, thought maybe Carl had told them everything after all. But then I heard the voice, muffled through the door, but unmistakable. "Mrs. Turner? Helen? Are you in there?" It was Carl. He'd come back. I pulled my hand out of the hole and stood on legs that barely held me, stumbling toward the door. When I opened it, he was standing there in the weak October sunlight, looking even worse than he had 3 days ago. His eyes were rimmed with red, like he hadn't slept. His clothes were the same ones he'd been wearing before, rumpled and stained, and in his hands he held a photograph. "You're still alive," he breathed, and there was genuine shock in his voice. "Jesus Christ, you're still alive!" "I thought, when you didn't answer your phone, I thought he'd thought who had what." My voice came out harsh, sharp. "What the hell is going on? What did you find in my crawl space?" Carl looked past me into the kitchen, saw the torn-up floor, the hole I'd made, and his face went even paler. "Oh God, you opened it. You actually opened it. Tell me what's down there." I grabbed his arm, my dirty gloves leaving marks on his jacket. "Tell me right now, or I swear to God I'll—" He thrust the photograph at me. "This," he said. "This is what's down there, or what used to be." My hands shook so badly I almost dropped it. The photograph was old. The colors faded to that yellow-brown of pictures from the 70s. It showed a young woman in a blue dress standing in front of a house. This house, my house, smiling at the camera. She had red hair that caught the sunlight, and freckles, and eyes that seemed to look right through the lens, right through time itself, straight at me, Lila Dawson. But it was what was written on the back that made my knees buckle. I turned the photo over with trembling fingers and read the words written in neat, careful handwriting that I recognized immediately as Arthur's. "For my Helen, to remember what I gave up for you. 1979. The world tilted sideways. I would have fallen if Carl hadn't caught me, his arms supporting me as my legs gave out completely. "I don't understand," I whispered. "I don't understand." "There's more," Carl said quietly. "I found a letter, hidden in the heating duct. written by someone who knew what happened, someone who knew what your husband did and why. Who? The word came out as barely a breath. Carl's eyes met mine, and in them I saw grief and rage and something else, something that looked like recognition, like he saw himself in me, two people whose lives had been shattered by the same man. My mother, he said. The letter was written by my mother. To me, the son she knew she'd never get to raise. And then I understood. God help me, I understood everything. The metal box wasn't a coffin. It was a grave. The address Carl gave me was on Maple Street, in the part of town where houses go to die. You know the kind of neighborhood I'm talking about, the kind where the American dream came to rot. Boarded up windows, with plywood so old it's turned silver with age. Porches sagging like broken backs. Chain-link fences strangled by weeds so tall they look like they're trying to escape. This was where people ended up when they'd run out of choices, run out of money, run out of hope. Number 247 stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, a small Cape Cod with paint peeling like sunburned skin. The mailbox hung at an angle, the numbers barely visible under layers of rust. A condemned sign was nailed to the front door, the official seal from the county faded but still legible. This house had been empty for a long time. Carl sat in my passenger seat, staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He hadn't said a word during the 20-minute drive, just gave me the address, and when I asked him if he was coming, he nodded once, sharp and quick, like he was afraid. If he thought about it too long, he'd lose his nerve. This was hers? I asked softly, my hand on the door handle but not opening it yet. Your mother's house? Her aunt's house, he said, his voice rough. Leela lived here for a while after her parents died. The aunt passed in '95. Place has been sitting ever since. I found the address in some old documents, public records. Took me 3 years to get up the courage to come here. 3 years. He'd been carrying this weight for 3 years, and I'd been carrying mine for 46, and neither of us had known the other existed until 3 days ago. We got out of the car, into the cold afternoon air. The sky was the color of old concrete, threatening rain. Dead leaves skittered across the broken driveway like frightened animals. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked, the sound lonely and desperate. The front door was locked, but Carl had brought a crowbar from his truck. The wood around the frame was so rotten that it gave way with barely any effort, splitting apart with a sound like dry kindling. The door swung open on rusty hinges, revealing darkness and the smell of abandonment, mildew and mouse droppings and time itself decaying. Maybe we shouldn't, I started to say, but Carl was already inside. I followed him into the gloom, my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was worse than the outside. Water damage had turned the ceiling into a topographic map of stains. The wallpaper, a cheerful floral pattern that must have been bright once, hung in strips like dead skin. Furniture sat covered in sheets gray with dust, looking like ghosts frozen in time. But someone had been here recently. I could tell by the footprints in the dust on the floor, leading from the door to the back of the house. Carl's footprints, I realized. He'd been here before, probably more than once, searching for answers in the ruins of his mother's life. This way, he said, and I followed him down a narrow hallway, past a bathroom where the mirror was so tarnished you couldn't see your reflection, past a bedroom with a mattress rotted through to the springs. At the end of the hall was a small room, barely bigger than a closet, with a single window covered by a sheet. Carl pulled the sheet down, and weak gray light filtered in, illuminating what was left of Lila Dawson's life. There was a vanity table against one wall, its mirror cracked down the middle. An old jewelry box sat on top, empty except for a single tarnished bracelet. A stack of books on a shelf. Romance novels mostly, their spines faded but titles still visible. Love's Tender Promise, The Heart Remembers, Forever Yours. Stories about love that lasted, about promises kept. And on the wall, in a frame whose glass had somehow survived intact, was a portrait. I knew it was her the moment I saw it. Even through the dust, even in the dim light, I knew. Lila Dawson stared out at me from that photograph with eyes that held something I recognized. Hope mixed with fear, joy mixed with uncertainty. She wore a blue dress, the same one from the photo Carl had shown me. But this was a formal portrait, the kind people got taken at department stores. She sat on a velvet bench with her hands folded in her lap, her red hair perfectly styled, her smile careful and practiced. She looked so young. God, she looked like a child playing dress-up. I stepped closer, my legs shaking, and that's when I saw what was written on the bottom of the frame, etched into the wood with something sharp. For Arthur, the man who promised to take care of me. The words hit me like a fist to the stomach. I actually gasped, the sound too loud in that dead room. My vision swam, black spots dancing at the edges, and I had to grip the edge of the vanity to keep from falling. "I'm sorry," Carl said behind me, his voice thick. "I'm so sorry you have to see this." But I couldn't stop looking. Couldn't stop seeing her young face, her hopeful eyes, her careful smile. Couldn't stop imagining Arthur looking at this same portrait, making promises he never intended to keep. "There's more," Carl said, and opened the drawer of the vanity. Inside was a letter, folded and refolded so many times, the creases had nearly torn through the paper. The envelope was addressed to, "My son, if anyone ever finds this." The handwriting was shaky, desperate. The letters uneven, like they'd been written by someone whose hand was trembling. Carl handed it to me. "Read it," he said. "You need to read it." My hands shook so badly I could barely unfold the paper. The date at the top was September 15th, 1979, 3 weeks before Lila disappeared. The words were water-stained in places, smudged, but still legible. "My dearest boy, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and you are old enough to understand. I am writing this because I know what's coming. I can feel it in the way Arthur looks at me now, not with love anymore, but with fear. Fear of what I represent, fear of what I'll cost him. I was a fool. I believed him when he said he loved me. I believed him when he said he'd leave his wife, that we'd raise you together, that we'd be a family. But men like Arthur don't leave. They bury their mistakes and move on. I told him about you last week. Told him I was pregnant, that I was keeping you no matter what. The look on his face, God, I'll never forget it. It wasn't joy or even anger. It was calculation. I could see him doing the math, figuring out how much I would cost him, his marriage, his reputation, his precious, perfect life. He asked me to take care of it. Those were his exact words. Take care of it. Like you were a problem to be solved, not a life to be cherished. I said no. I said I'd tell everyone. I'd tell his wife, his boss, the whole goddamn town if I had to. That's when I saw it in his eyes. The moment he decided. The moment he chose Helen over me. Chose his comfortable life over our future. Chose silence over truth. My son, you will never know your father, and I'm sorry for that. But I need you to know this. You were not a mistake. You were not a problem. You were loved. Every single day I carried you, even though I knew that love might get me killed. If anyone finds this, tell them the truth. Tell them Arthur Holbrook Turner murdered me to keep his secret. Tell them he buried me somewhere no one would ever look, probably under that house he was so proud of, that house he built with his perfect wife in his perfect neighborhood. Tell them my son never knew his father because his father was a coward and a killer. I loved you before I ever met you. Remember that. Your mother, Lila Dawson. The letter fell from my hands, drifting to the dusty floor like a dead leaf. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what I'd just read. The room spun around me, and I heard a sound coming from somewhere far away. A keening, broken sound like an animal in pain. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from me. Carl caught me as I collapsed, his arms the only thing keeping me from hitting the floor. "I know," he whispered, and he was crying too, his tears falling onto my hair. "I know, God, I know." We stayed like that for I don't know how long, two strangers bound together by the same terrible truce, holding each other up in the ruins of a dead woman's room while the ghost of Arthur's betrayal hung in the air between us. When I could finally speak, My voice came out cracked and raw. He was building our house in 1979, I said. We moved in that December. The kitchen was the last room finished. He did the floor himself, said he wanted it to be perfect. A sob caught in my throat. He buried her under our kitchen floor while I was picking out curtains and planning where to put the Christmas tree. Carl's face was wet with tears. She was 23, he said, pregnant and alone and terrified, and he killed her to keep his secret. I looked at that portrait again, at Lila's hopeful face, and I saw my own reflection in the cracked glass. 70 years old, face lined with age, and now with horror. The wife of a murderer, the woman who'd slept above a grave for 46 years without knowing it. We have to tell someone, I whispered. They won't believe us, Carl said. Not without proof. But we both knew where the proof was. Back in my kitchen, under my floor, in that metal box with Arthur's initials carved into the lid. We had to go back. We had to open it. We had to face whatever Arthur had buried there all those years ago, even if it destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life, even if it destroyed me. The police station smelled like burned coffee and bureaucracy. I sat in a plastic chair that squeaked every time I moved, clutching Lila's letter in my hands while fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps. Carl sat beside me, his leg bouncing nervously, that constant tremor that seemed to live in his body now. We'd been waiting for 45 minutes, watching officers shuffle past with paperwork and donuts, their faces bored and indifferent. Detective Morrison finally called us into his office at 3:30. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a mustache that looked like it belonged in a 70s cop show, and eyes that had seen too much and cared too little. The nameplate on his desk was crooked. A half-eaten sandwich sat next to his computer, mayonnaise leaking onto a napkin. "Mrs. Turner," he said, not standing up, barely looking at me. "What can I do for you today?" I placed the letter on his desk with trembling hands. "My husband murdered a woman in 1979, I said, and hearing the words out loud made them real in a way they hadn't been before. "Her name was Lila Dawson. She's buried under my kitchen floor." Detective Morrison picked up the letter, his expression unchanging. He read it slowly, taking his time, while I sat there feeling my heart hammer against my ribs. When he finished, he set it down and leaned back in his chair, which groaned under his weight. "Mrs. Turner," he said, his voice patient in that condescending way that made my skin crawl. "Your husband, Arthur Turner, he passed away 5 years ago, is that correct?" "Yes, but..." "And this letter," he tapped it with one thick finger, "was written by a woman who's been missing since 1979, a case that was investigated thoroughly at the time and closed as a probable runaway." "She didn't run away," Carl said, his voice tight. "She was murdered by Arthur Turner. My mother was murdered." Morrison's eyes flicked to Carl, assessing. "And you are?" "Carl Hewson. My mother was Lila Dawson. I was born 3 months after she disappeared, delivered by emergency C-section when they found her aunt dead in that house on Maple Street. Social services said my mother abandoned me there. But she didn't abandon me. She was already dead." I watched Morrison's face, desperate to see some flicker of belief, some sign that he understood the weight of what we were telling him. But his expression remained neutral, professional, closed. "Mr. Hewson," he said slowly, "I understand this is emotional for you, but what you're describing, these are serious accusations against a deceased man who can't defend himself. Arthur Turner was a respected member of this community, ran a successful insurance business, volunteered at St. Catherine's, never had so much as a parking ticket. That's because no one knew what he did," I said, my voice rising. "No one knew what kind of man he really was. But I know now. I've seen the evidence. There's a metal box buried under my kitchen floor with his initials on it from 1979, the same year Lila disappeared." Morrison sighed, the sound of a man who'd heard too many conspiracy theories, too many desperate stories from desperate people. "Mrs. Turner, with all due respect, a metal box with initials isn't evidence of murder. It could be anything. Old documents, family heirlooms, time capsule materials. People bury all kinds of things under their houses." "Then come look at it," Carl demanded. "Come to the house and see for yourself. I can't just excavate someone's property based on a 46-year-old letter and some scratches in the floor." Morrison stood up, clearly done with the conversation. "If you want to pursue this, you'll need to bring me something concrete. Physical evidence, not speculation in old paper." "This letter is evidence." I stood too, my chair scraping back. "She wrote that Arthur was going to kill her and then she disappeared. How is that not evidence? It's evidence that she cared, not evidence that your husband did anything to her." Morrison's voice was firm now, dismissive. "Mrs. Turner, I understand you've recently undergone a renovation. Sometimes when people dig up old houses, they start imagining things. Old buildings have histories. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." The phrase hit me like a slap. Let sleeping dogs lie. That's what Arthur had always said when I asked about things he didn't want to discuss. When I asked about his long hours at the office, about the phone calls he took in the garage, about why we couldn't renovate the kitchen. Let sleeping dogs lie, Helen. "Get out," I said quietly. Morrison blinked. "Excuse me? Out of here with your condescending bullshit and your sleeping dogs." My voice was shaking now, fury replacing desperation. A woman was murdered. A baby grew up without his mother. And you're sitting here eating your sandwich and telling me to let it go, because it's inconvenient for you to do your goddamn job. "Mrs. Turner, my husband was a monster," I said, and the words felt like breaking glass in my throat. And I was too blind, too trusting, too much in love with the idea of who I thought he was to see it. But I see it now. I see everything now. And if you won't help me prove it, I'll prove it myself. I grabbed the letter off his desk and turned to leave. Carl followed, but at the door, I stopped and looked back at Morrison, who was watching us with that same bored expression. "When I find her body," I said, "and I will find it, I'm going to make sure everyone knows that you refused to help, that you dismissed a murder victim because it was easier than admitting that one of your respected citizens was a killer." Outside, the October air felt like freedom after the suffocating atmosphere of that office. I was shaking, with rage, with grief, with something that felt like the last threads of my old life snapping one by one. Carl walked beside me to the car, silent. When we got in, I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, staring at the police station through tears I refused to let fall. "They never believe people like us," Carl said quietly. "The dead can't defend themselves, so the living defend them instead. Protect their memories, protect their legacies, even when those legacies are built on graves." I started the car, my hands steadier now than they'd been in days. "Then we do it ourselves," I said. "We open that box, we find the proof, and we make them listen. Your children," Carl said hesitantly. "They'll have to know. You can't hide this from them once we start digging." I thought about Michael and Ruth, my babies, now grown with families of their own. Michael with his 3 boys and his perfect suburban life. Ruth with her yoga studio and her farmer's market Sundays and her belief in the inherent goodness of people. How do you tell your children that their father was a murderer, that the man who taught them to ride bikes and went to their school plays and walked them down the aisle was capable of putting his hands around a young woman's throat and squeezing until she stopped breathing? How do you tell them that every memory they have is contaminated by that truth? "They'll hate me," I whispered. "Maybe," Carl said, "but they'll hate themselves more if they never know, if they spend their lives defending a man who doesn't deserve defending." We drove back to my house in silence. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if I could feel anything besides this hollowness in my chest. When we pulled into the driveway, I saw Ruth's car parked on the street. My daughter sat on my front porch, arms wrapped around her knees, and when she saw me, she stood up. Even from a distance, I could see she'd been crying. Her mascara had run, leaving dark tracks down her cheeks. Her hair, usually perfect in its blonde bun, hung loose around her shoulders. "Mom," she said, and her voice broke on the word. "Where have you been? I've been calling for days. Michael's been going crazy. We thought something happened to you." I looked at my daughter. at her worried face, at the remnants of tears, at the love and fear mixed together in her expression, and I knew that the next words out of my mouth would change everything between us forever. Carl got out of the car, and Ruth's eyes went to him confused. "Who is this?" "Ruth," I said, and my voice was steady now, cold and clear. "I need to tell you something about your father, and I need you to listen, really listen before you say anything." "What are you talking about?" She looked between me and Carl, suspicion creeping into her expression. "Mom, you're scaring me." I walked up the porch steps, pulled the letter from my purse, and handed it to her. "Read this," I said, "and then we're going inside, and we're going to finish what I started. We're going to dig up the kitchen floor, and we're going to find the truth your father buried there 46 years ago." Ruth unfolded the letter, her hands shaking, and as her eyes moved across the words, I watched my daughter's face transform from confusion to disbelief to horror, and I knew, God help me, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Ruth dropped the letter like it had burned her fingers. "No," she said, backing away from me, shaking her head so hard her hair whipped across her face. "No, no, no! This is insane! Mom, this is someone's sick joke. Dad would never, he couldn't. Ruth, stop!" She held up her hands, tears streaming down her face now. "Just stop. I don't know what's happening to you, but this isn't real. Dad was a good man. He was a good father. He would never hurt anyone, let alone—" She couldn't even say it. Couldn't form the word murder with her mouth. Carl stood at the bottom of the porch steps, watching this family drama unfold with the weariness of someone who'd lived through his own version of it. "Your mother is telling the truth," he said quietly. "I wish she wasn't. God, I wish this was all made up, but it's not. And who the hell are you?" Ruth spun on him, her grief turning to rage. "Some random man who shows up with my mother and a fake letter trying to destroy my father's memory. What do you want? Money? Is this some kind of scam?" "I'm Lila Dawson's son," Carl said, and his voice was so tired, so defeated. "Arthur Turner got my mother pregnant, and when she refused to get rid of me, he killed her. And your mother has been living on top of her grave for 46 years without knowing it." Ruth laughed, a horrible, broken sound. "You're crazy. You're both crazy." She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Mom, please, tell me you don't actually believe this." I wanted to lie. God, how I wanted to tell her it was all a mistake, that we'd figured it out wrong, that her father was still the hero she remembered. But I'd spent 5 days living with the truth, and I couldn't put that weight back down. Not now, not ever. "We need to open the box," I said, "the one under the kitchen floor. If I'm wrong, if this is all some terrible misunderstanding, then we'll find that out. But if I'm right," I took a shaky breath, "if I'm right, then we owe it to Lila to tell her story, to give her the justice she never got. I won't let you do this," Ruth said, her voice rising. "I won't let you tear apart this family based on some letter from a disturbed woman and the word of a stranger." "Then leave," I said, and the coldness in my own voice surprised me. "Go home to your perfect life and your yoga classes and pretend you never saw that letter. Pretend your father was the man you thought he was. But I can't pretend anymore, Ruth. I won't." We stood there on the porch, mother and daughter, staring at each other across a chasm that had opened up in the last 10 minutes. I could see her struggling, see the war happening behind her eyes, the need to defend her father versus the terrible seed of doubt that letter had planted. Finally, she wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. "Fine," she said. "Open the damn box. And when you find nothing but old tax documents or family photos, you're going to get help. Real help. Because this obsession is destroying you." We went inside together, the 3 of us, moving through my house like mourners at a funeral. The kitchen looked even worse in the fading evening light. Torn up, violated, the floorboards scattered like broken bones. The hole I'd started digging gaped in the floor like an open wound. Carl had brought tools from his truck, a proper crowbar, work gloves, a lantern that cast harsh white light into the shadows. He set up the lantern next to the hole and knelt down, looking at me. Are you sure you want to do this? No, I wanted to scream. No, I'm not sure. I want to go back to last week, when my biggest problem was choosing between granite and quartz countertops. I want to go back to the woman I was before Carl knocked on my door with terror in his eyes. But that woman was dead now, murdered by the truth, just as surely as Lila had been murdered by Arthur's hands. Do it, I said. Carl positioned the crowbar under the edge of the metal box and pushed down. The wood around it splintered with a crack that sounded like gunfire. Ruth flinched beside me, her hand finding mine and squeezing so tight it hurt. Once, twice, 3 times, Carl pried at the box, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold, until finally it came loose with a grinding sound of metal on earth. The smell that rose up was indescribable, not the overwhelming stench of decay that had long since faded, but something older, deeper, the smell of secrets kept too long, of earth that had held darkness for decades, the smell of a grave. Carl reached in with gloved hands and pulled the box up. It was heavier than I expected, requiring both his hands to lift. He set it on the floor between us, this metal coffin painted over with tar. Arthur's initials still visible despite the years. 1979, A.H., Ruth read, her voice barely a whisper. I saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. That's his handwriting, on the side. That's definitely his handwriting. The lid was sealed with some kind of industrial adhesive, black and cracked with age. Carl worked the crowbar under the edge carefully, like a surgeon making an incision. The seal fought him for a moment, then gave way with a sound like tearing fabric. Wait, I said suddenly, my hand shooting out to stop him. Wait, if we open this, if there's really... I couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say the words evidence of murder or human remains, because saying them would make them real. We have to know, Carl said gently. You know we have to know. I nodded, unable to speak, and he lifted the lid. Inside was a layer of oilcloth, yellowed and stiff. Carl pulled it back carefully, and underneath, not a body. Thank God, not a body, but something almost worse. Something that told a story without words. A woman's necklace, gold with a small locket, the chain broken. Inside the locket, a tiny photograph of a young Lila smiling. Next to it, a wallet with her driver's license still visible through the plastic window. Lila Ann Dawson, D.O.B. 3/15/1956. A watch with a cracked crystal and dried blood on the band. A ring, not an engagement ring, but a simple band with forever engraved inside. And documents. God, so many documents. Birth certificate for Carl, listed as baby boy Dawson. Mother, Lila Ann Dawson. Father, unknown. Medical records showing Lila had been 12 weeks pregnant when she died. A life insurance policy in Arthur's handwriting, taken out on Lila 2 weeks before she disappeared, with him listed as the beneficiary. And at the bottom, wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture, a letter. Not written by Lila this time, but by Arthur himself. Dated November 30th, 1979, 1 week before we moved into this house. Ruth reached for it with shaking hands, but I grabbed it first. This was my burden to bear, my husband's confession, my nightmare to read. I unfolded the pages, and Arthur's handwriting swam before my eyes. That familiar script I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists and love notes left on the counter for 45 years. My hands shook so badly, Carl had to hold the lantern closer so I could read. If anyone finds this, I want them to know it was an accident, it began, and I felt my heart crack open. I never meant to hurt her, but she wouldn't listen. She kept saying she'd tell Helen, tell everyone, ruin everything I'd built. She said the baby was mine, our mistake, and she was going to make sure everyone knew. I only meant to scare her, to make her understand how much she had to lose, but she fought back. She scratched my face, screamed that she'd go to the newspapers, that she'd destroy my reputation, even if it destroyed her too. My hands went around her throat. I only wanted her to stop talking, to stop threatening me, but she kept struggling, kept fighting, and I couldn't let go. Couldn't let her go tell Helen, Couldn't let her ruin the life I'd worked so hard to build. When she stopped moving, I knew what I had to do. The house, our new house, was still under construction. The kitchen floor wasn't finished. I could bury her there, seal her underneath where no one would ever look, where Helen would cook dinners and wash dishes and live her life never knowing what lay beneath her feet. I told myself it was mercy, that Lila had forced my hand, that I was protecting my family. But I know the truth. I killed her because she was inconvenient, because a scandal would have cost me everything. My marriage, my business, my standing in the community. I killed her because my comfort mattered more than her life. God forgive me. I don't expect Helen ever will. The letter fell from my hands. I couldn't hold it anymore. Couldn't bear the weight of those words. 45 years of marriage. 45 years of sleeping next to a man who'd strangled a pregnant woman and buried her under our kitchen. 45 years of love built on a foundation of murder. Ruth was sobbing now. Great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. She'd picked up the necklace, was holding it in her hands like a sacred relic, and I realized she was praying, actually praying through her tears. Carl sat back on his heels, his face wet with tears. She was 23, he said. My mother was 23 years old, younger than I am now, and he killed her for wanting to be a mother, for wanting him to take responsibility. I looked at that box, at all the evidence of Lila's stolen life, and something inside me that had been holding on finally let go. I fell to my knees on the torn-up kitchen floor, and I screamed, a sound that came from somewhere so deep and primal, I didn't recognize it as my own voice. 45 years of grief for a woman I never knew. 45 years of lies I lived without questioning. When the scream finally died, leaving my throat raw, I looked up at my daughter through tears and asked the question I'd been too afraid to voice. Did you ever suspect? Did some part of you ever know your father was capable of this? Ruth's face crumpled. There were moments, she whispered, times when he'd get angry, and I'd see something in his eyes that scared me. But I told myself I was imagining things, that fathers don't, that people don't. She couldn't finish. We sat there in silence, the three of us, surrounding this box of horrors. Outside, the night had fallen completely. Inside, the truth had finally come to light. Michael arrived at 6 the next morning, pounding on the door like he was trying to break it down. I hadn't slept. None of us had. Ruth had finally fallen into an exhausted doze on the living room couch around 4 a.m., her face still tear-stained, one hand clutching her phone like a lifeline. Carl had stayed too, sitting vigil in Arthur's old armchair. The irony wasn't lost on me, staring at nothing while the hours crawled past. And I'd sat at the kitchen table, looking at that metal box and its contents spread out like evidence at a crime scene, trying to reconcile the man I'd loved with the monster he'd been. When Michael's fist hit the door, Ruth jerked awake with a gasp. Carl stood up slowly, his joints cracking, and I just sat there, too exhausted to move, too hollowed out to care. "Mom!" Michael's voice carried through the door, angry and frightened in equal measure. "Mom, open this door right now or I'm calling the police!" Ruth stumbled to the door and opened it, and Michael burst in like a storm made flesh. My son, 42 years old, wearing his business suit even at this ungodly hour, his hair graying at the temples just like Arthur's had. The resemblance had never bothered me before. Now it made my stomach turn. What the hell is going on? He looked around wildly, taking in Ruth's disheveled appearance, Carl's presence, me sitting like a ghost at the table. Ruth called me at midnight, hysterical, saying something about Dad and a dead woman, and he stopped, his eyes landing on the metal box, on the contents spread across my kitchen table. "What is all this?" "Michael," Ruth said, her voice hoarse from crying, "you need to sit down." "I don't need to sit down. I need someone to explain to me why my mother has been ignoring my calls for a week, why there's a stranger in this house, and why my sister is having some kind of breakdown." His eyes found Carl, narrowed. "Who are you?" Carl met his gaze steadily. "Carl Hewson. My mother was Lila Dawson. Your father murdered her in 1979, and buried her remains under this kitchen floor. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the refrigerator humming, hear Mrs. Patterson's dog barking 3 houses down, hear my own heart beating its slow, steady rhythm. Michael's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, a forced laugh that sounded nothing like his real one. That's insane. That's the most insane thing I've ever heard. Ruth, tell me you don't actually believe this. Ruth's face crumpled again. Mike, there's evidence. A letter Dad wrote, confessing, documents, her belongings. It's all real. Bullshit. Michael strode to the table, grabbed Arthur's confession, and started reading. I watched his face as his eyes moved across the words, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his hands begin to shake. When he finished, he threw the letter down like it had burned him. This is a forgery. It has to be. Someone made this up to extort us, or... It's his handwriting, Michael. My voice came out flat, dead. You know it is. Look at the way he makes his capital T's, the way he loops his H's. That's your father's handwriting. No. He was backing away from the table now, shaking his head. No, this is insane. Dad was a good man. He volunteered at church, for Christ's sake. He coached my Little League team. He walked Ruth down the aisle. He was a murderer, Carl said quietly. He was a murderer who was very good at pretending to be a good man. Michael's face twisted with rage. He lunged at Carl, grabbed him by the shirt, slammed him against the wall. You shut your mouth about my father. You come into this house with your lies and your fake documents, and you think you can destroy 40 years of memories? Mike, stop! Ruth tried to pull him off, but Michael was bigger, stronger, fueled by grief and denial. He killed a pregnant woman, Carl shouted, not fighting back, just taking it. He strangled my mother because she was inconvenient, because she threatened his perfect life. And then he buried her and went on living like nothing happened, like she didn't matter, like I didn't matter. Something in Carl's voice, the raw pain, the absolute conviction, made Michael's grip loosen. He stepped back, his chest heaving, and for the first time since he'd arrived, I saw doubt creep into his expression. Show him the rest, I said to Ruth. Show him what else we found. Ruth picked up Lila's driver's license with shaking hands and held it out to Michael. This was in the box, along with her necklace, her watch, medical records showing she was pregnant, and a life insurance policy Dad took out on her 2 weeks before she disappeared, with him as the beneficiary. Michael took the license, stared at the photo of young Lila smiling at the camera, and I saw the exact moment the truth hit him. His knees buckled and he sank into a chair, still holding that license, his thumb tracing the edge like he could will it not to be real. This doesn't make sense, he whispered. Dad he couldn't have... His voice broke. He taught me how to tie my shoes. He came to every one of my baseball games. He told me he loved me every single day. I know, I said, and my voice was gentler now because I understood. I understood the desperate need to make the person we loved fit with the monster we'd discovered. He loved you, Michael. He loved all of us. But he was also capable of terrible things. Both things can be true at the same time. No. Michael stood up abruptly, the chair scraping back. No, I don't accept this. There has to be another explanation. Maybe he was protecting someone. Maybe he took the blame for something he didn't do. Maybe you're willing to twist yourself into knots to avoid facing the truth, Carl said. And there was no anger in his voice now, just exhaustion. I've spent 3 years doing that. 3 years trying to find some way to make this not real. But it is real. Your father killed my mother. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner we can all start to heal. Heal. Michael's laugh was bitter. How do we heal from this? How do we go back to our lives knowing that everything we thought we knew was a lie? That every memory we have is contaminated by this? He looked at me, his eyes pleading. Mom, how do you live with this? I don't know yet, I admitted. But I know we can't pretend it didn't happen. We can't protect his memory at the cost of Lila's truth. She deserves better than that. Carl deserves better than that. Michael looked at Carl for a long moment, really looked at him, and I saw him taking in the dark hair. The shape of the jaw, the haunted eyes. "You really are her son," he said finally. "You have her coloring. From the photo." Carl nodded. "I never knew her, never got to hear her voice or feel her hold me. Your father took that from me, but I won't let him take her story too. I won't let her be forgotten, buried under this floor like she never mattered." "What do you want from us?" Michael asked, and he sounded so tired, so defeated. "Money? An apology? What?" "I want the truth to be told," Carl said simply. "I want the police to reopen her case. I want her name cleared. She wasn't a runaway who abandoned her baby. She was a victim. And I want—" his voice broke. "I want to bury her properly, to give her a grave with her name on it, where people can visit and remember she existed." Michael looked at the contents of the box again, at the evidence of his father's crime, and I watched him struggling with the same impossible choice I'd faced. Protect the man we loved or honor the woman he'd killed. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I'm calling Detective Morrison," he said. "I'll make them listen this time. And then," he swallowed hard, "then we do whatever needs to be done to make this right." Ruth crossed the room and took his hand, squeezed it. Brother and sister, united in grief and horror, trying to find solid ground in a world that had just shattered beneath them. "There's one more thing," I said quietly. "Something I need to tell you both before the police get involved." They looked at me, waiting, and I forced myself to say the words I'd been avoiding since we'd opened that box. "I'm putting this house on the market. Once they recover her remains, once the investigation is complete, I'm selling it and I'm never coming back. I can't live here anymore. Can't sleep in the bedroom I shared with your father. Can't cook in the kitchen where he buried his victim. Can't pretend that these walls aren't soaked in lies." "Mom," Ruth started, but I held up my hand. "I know what this means. This house is your childhood, your memories. But they're tainted now, don't you see? Every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every family dinner, all of it happened on top of a grave. And I can't unsee that. I can't unknow it." Michael nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. "And honestly, I don't think I can ever walk through that door again without seeing—" He couldn't finish. "Then we agree," I said. "We tell the truth. We help Carl get justice for his mother. And then we let this house go." Carl looked at me with tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for believing me, for choosing the truth even when it cost you everything." But I shook my head. "It already cost me everything the moment your mother died. I just didn't know it yet." Outside, the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new day, a new chapter, built on the ruins of everything we thought we knew. And somewhere beneath our feet, Lila Dawson waited for justice that was 46 years overdue. The night they excavated Lila Dawson's remains was the longest night of my life. It took 3 weeks for the county to approve the dig. 3 weeks of Michael and Ruth working tirelessly with lawyers, of Detective Morrison finally taking us seriously once he saw Arthur's confession, of news crews camping outside my house like vultures waiting for death. 3 weeks of living in a motel because I couldn't bear to sleep in that house anymore. Couldn't walk through rooms that suddenly felt like a mausoleum. The national news picked up the story. Suburban house of horrors. Wife discovers husband's dark secret after 46 years. They made it sound like a movie, like entertainment, not the destruction of everything I'd ever believed in. Reporters called constantly, offered money for exclusive interviews. I refused them all, but I agreed to be there the night they dug. Carl deserved that much. Deserved to have someone there who understood what this meant. And I needed to see it through, needed to witness the final truth being unearthed. They came at midnight, forensic teams in white suits, police officers creating a perimeter, spotlights turning my backyard into something that looked like an alien landing site. The neighbors stood on their porches watching, and I could feel their judgment, their whispers. Did she really not know? How could she not have known? I stood with Carl and Ruth and Michael behind the police tape they'd strung across my yard, watching strangers tear apart the foundation of my kitchen. They'd gotten a warrant to excavate the entire area beneath where the kitchen had been, using ground-penetrating radar to locate exactly where Arthur had buried her. The first shovelful of earth came up at 12:47 a.m. I know because I was watching the clock on my phone, counting every minute, every second. Ruth held my hand so tight I lost feeling in my fingers. Michael stood rigid beside us, his jaw clenched, his eyes wet but refusing to let the tears fall. And Carl stood apart from us, his arms wrapped around himself like he was trying to hold his body together through sheer force of will. By 2 a.m., they'd found the first bone. A forensic anthropologist, a young woman with kind eyes and careful hands, knelt in the dirt and brushed away the soil with something that looked like a paintbrush, revealing what she said was a femur, human, female, buried for approximately 4 to 5 decades. I heard Carl make a sound, not quite a sob, not quite a gasp, something in between. Ruth turned away, pressing her face against Michael's shoulder, but I couldn't look away. I owed Lila that much. I owed her my witness. They worked through the night, painstaking and methodical, documenting everything, photographing each bone as they uncovered it. The forensic anthropologist talked in a low voice to the detectives, explaining what she was finding. Hyoid bone fractured, consistent with manual strangulation. Pelvic structure shows signs of pregnancy, approximately 12 to 14 weeks. Several defensive wounds on the forearm bones. She fought back. Each clinical detail felt like a knife to my heart. She fought back. Of course she fought back. She was 23 years old, pregnant with her first child, fighting for both their lives against a man who'd promised to love her, against my husband. Around 4 in the morning, they found something else, something that made the lead detective call everyone over. Wrapped in the remnants of what might have once been a blanket, they'd found a small metal tin. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, preserved by the metal and the tar Arthur had used to seal them. Photos of Lila and Arthur together, at a restaurant, his arm around her shoulders, in front of the office building where they worked, standing too close. In what looked like a hotel room, her head on his chest, both of them smiling at the camera. Evidence of an affair that Arthur had buried along with its consequences. But it was the last photo in that tin that broke me completely. A sonogram. The edges curled and faded, but you could still make out the tiny bean shape of a 12-week-old fetus. On the back, in Lila's handwriting, our baby boy. Due March 1980. I can't wait for you to meet him. Carl saw it at the same moment I did. The detective had held it up to examine it, and in the harsh glare of the spotlights, we both saw what Arthur had destroyed. Not just Lila, not just their baby, but the future they might have had, the life that could have been. Carl's knees buckled, and he went down, right there in the dirt, and the sound that came out of him was inhuman. It was the sound of a man's heart breaking for a mother he never knew, and a father who'd rather murder than claim him. Michael moved to help him up, but Carl waved him off, stayed on his knees in the dirt, and wept. I went to him then, stepping under the police tape before anyone could stop me, and I knelt beside him in the mud and the horror. I put my arms around this young man who my husband had orphaned before he was even born, and I held him while he shattered. "I'm sorry," I whispered into his hair, over and over like a prayer. "I'm so sorry. If I'd known, if I'd suspected—" "You couldn't have known," he choked out. "He was too good at hiding it, too good at being two different people. But I should have known, shouldn't I? Wives are supposed to know. We're supposed to see the signs, sense the wrongness. But I'd been so busy being grateful. Grateful that a man like Arthur had chosen me. Grateful for my beautiful home and my beautiful children and my beautiful life. I'd been so grateful I hadn't looked beneath the surface." They finished the excavation as the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed obscene, given what we'd just witnessed. Every bone accounted for, every piece of evidence catalogued. The remains of Lila Ann Dawson, finally free from her grave after 46 years. The forensic anthropologist approached us as they were loading the remains into the medical examiner's van. "I want you to know," she said to Carl, her voice gentle, "that we'll treat her with dignity. She'll be cleaned carefully, documented thoroughly, and then she can have a proper burial, with her name on a headstone, with flowers and visitors and people who'll remember her." Carl nodded, unable to speak. I spoke for him. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you for giving her that." As the sun climbed higher, the crews began packing up their equipment. The spectacle was over. The secret was out. All that remained was the aftermath, the crater in my backyard, the hole in all our hearts, the truth that would follow us for the rest of our lives. Detective Morrison approached us, looking exhausted. "The DA will want to close the case," he said. "Rule it a murder. Name Arthur Turner as the perpetrator. Since he's deceased, there won't be a trial, but there will be a public record. Everyone will know what he did." "Good," Michael said, his voice hard. "Let them know. Let everyone know what kind of man he really was." I looked at my son, at the way his face had aged 10 years in 3 weeks, at the bitterness that had taken root in his eyes. This was Arthur's legacy too. Not just a murdered woman, but children who would spend the rest of their lives wondering if they'd inherited their father's capacity for violence, questioning every memory, doubting every moment of love. "I want to be there," Carl said suddenly, "when they bury her properly. I want to be there to say goodbye." "We all will," Ruth said, speaking for the first time in hours. She looked at me, then at Carl. "She's family too, in a way. The worst kind of family connection, but family nonetheless." We stood there as the sun rose higher, the 4 of us bound together by Arthur's crime, his widow, his children, and the son he'd never acknowledged. We looked at the excavation site, at the earth that had held Lila's secret for so long, and I felt something shift inside me. The house would be demolished. The county had already approved it. Too much contamination, too much evidence of crime, too much death soaked into the foundation. They'd tear it down, haul it away, leave nothing but bare earth. And I was glad. Glad that every board and nail and brick would be destroyed. Glad that no family would ever make memories there again, never knowing they were building their happiness on top of someone's grave. "What will you do now?" Carl asked me as we walked back to our cars, the neighborhood slowly waking up around us, people heading to work and school, living their normal lives while ours lay in ruins. "I don't know," I admitted. "Start over, I suppose. Though I don't know how you start over at 70 years old. Don't know how you rebuild a life when the foundation was rotten all along." "You were a victim too," Carl said firmly. "You didn't know. You couldn't have stopped it. He lied to you just like he lied to her. But had I been a victim? Or had I been complicit in my own blindness, choosing comfort over curiosity, choosing the beautiful lie over the ugly truth? I would spend the rest of my life trying to answer that question. 3 months later, we buried Lila Ann Dawson in St. Catherine's Cemetery, under an oak tree not far from where Arthur lay. Carl had chosen the spot deliberately, close enough that Arthur would have to spend eternity knowing what he'd done, far enough that Lila could rest without his shadow falling on her grave. The headstone was simple, white marble with her name, her dates, and a single line that Carl had chosen: "Beloved Mother," silenced but not forgotten. We all came, me, Michael and his wife and their 3 boys, Ruth and her husband, Carl and his girlfriend. Even Detective Morrison came, standing at a respectful distance, bearing witness, as they lowered her remains into the earth, this time with prayers and flowers and people who mourned her. I placed my hand over my heart and made her a promise. I would tell her story. I would make sure that every person who'd known Arthur Turner, who'd respected him and admired him and called him friend, would know what he'd really been. I would make sure that Lila's name lived on, that her death meant something, that her son could hold his head up and say "my mother" without shame. It was the only way I knew to make amends, the only way to live with the weight of what I'd unknowingly been part of. After the service, Carl gave me the necklace they'd found in the box, Lila's locket with her photo inside. "I think she'd want you to have it," he said, "not as a burden, but as a reminder that truth matters more than comfort, that justice delayed is still justice." I wear it every day now, that small gold locket resting against my heart. And every time I feel its weight, I remember the price of willful blindness, I remember that love without truth is just another word for lie. The end. Sometimes the heaviest truths are the ones we carry without knowing. For 46 years, I walked across that kitchen floor, never suspecting that beneath my feet lay a young woman's stolen future, a love turned to murder, a secret that would outlive the man who buried it. They ask me now if I should have known, if there were signs I ignored, if love made me blind, or if evil is just that good at hiding. The truth is, I'll spend the rest of my life asking myself the same questions. But I know this: choosing comfort over truth doesn't make the truth disappear. It just means someone else pays the price for our willful blindness. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you have had the courage to dig up your entire life, knowing it might destroy everything you believed in? Would you have chosen justice for a stranger over protecting the memory of someone you loved? These are the questions that haunt me in the quiet hours, and perhaps they'll haunt you too. Because this story isn't just about what my husband did. It's about what we all do when faced with uncomfortable truths. Do we look away, or do we have the courage to bear witness, even when it costs us everything? Lila Dawson has a headstone now. Her son knows her name, and I wear her locket every day as a reminder that the truth, no matter how painful, is always worth fighting for. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the secrets we keep and the lies we live with, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below and tell me what you would have done in my shoes. Because sometimes the conversations that matter most are the ones that make us uncomfortable. Thank you for listening to my story. May you never have to live one like it.